Right, so hopefully you have done the 8 stages of the narrative and you have a good story that you want to tell. But at the end of any project, I like to think about the introductions and the conclusions. This is one of the last things you want to look at so that you can make sure you have a really strong beginning and a really strong ending. Our first words and our last words are usually the ones that are remembered the most. So I want to talk about hooks today, and there's a bunch of different kinds of hooks. You might have called these attention grabbers or some other term, but they just basically mean getting the attention of your audience right at the beginning. So these examples that I have for you are not necessarily from a narrative. They're for any essay, but they can still apply to a narrative. So the first one is that some people like to start with a rhetorical question. And I think we've already talked about rhetorical meaning persuasive. So you would ask some kind of persuasive question. For example, if my essay was going to be about sexual education, I might start with a question that I don't necessarily want answered, but that's going to prove my points. So I might start out and say, have you ever thought about the responsibility of raising a child? What are the financial costs, the emotional costs? How do you know when you're ready? I'm not expecting the audience to answer those, but it definitely introduces my subject and gets them thinking. So one way to start is with a rhetorical question. Another way is with an interesting or unusual statistic. A lot of people appreciate logic and logos, so starting with a statistic really grabs their attention and makes them think that you're serious. So I have an example here that says, and it's just a completely made up example. In a recent survey, 68% of students in the dorms admit that they are sexually active, and almost 18% of those students don't use protection. So if I was doing the same essay about sexual education and how important it is to educate students, having a statistic that shows a lot of people are affected by this would be important. Just making a strong statement also works. Going with the same topic, if we don't start educating students on campus about sexual reproduction, we will certainly end up with a decreased student body as men and women are forced to sacrifice their education to raise babies. Again, these are not necessarily ones that you would use in a narrative, but these are good ways to get people's attention. Obviously, your narrative is probably not on this topic, but you might be able to come up with a really strong statement or a statistic or question that could start off your story. This one probably won't work for a narrative, but I want to share it with you anyway because it's a pretty common hook. So a good way to catch the reader's interest is to tell a brief story. In this case, we're telling a story throughout the entire essay, so we wouldn't want to start with a different story, but this is still a good hook to use for other essays. So I might have a hypothetical story, which is not a real story, but it's a story that's sort of made up to prove a point. So I might say Marco was only 19 when he found out his girlfriend was pregnant. They'd only been dating for 3 months, and now they were about to be committed to each other for the rest of their lives. You can see how starting out like that lets people know what my topic is and grabs their interest. Okay, the reason I'm bringing up these 4 hooks is because I want you to think about the end of your essay. And I'm actually going to go all the way down here and say, did you know that conclusions can also have a hook? Especially in a story, it's important that you come full circle, that you make a circle and the ending relates back to the beginning somehow. This gives the reader a sense of completion. They feel like they've come to the end and it relates back to the beginning. So the circle has been completed. So if you have a hook at the beginning, you should try to revisit it here. This is definitely a good strategy for a narrative. But again, these are strategies that can work for any essay. So I have a little chart here that kind of shows what that might look like. If I had a rhetorical question at the beginning, I might end my essay by saying, are you ready today? Of course, it's still not a question that I want them to answer yes or no to. It's just a rhetorical question. But by asking questions at the beginning and then asking questions at the end, the reader feels like we've made a complete circle. If I had started with the strong statement, I could certainly end with another strong statement. If we're able to educate students, we could create a generation of men and women who don't have to make sacrifices. Let's show them they can get an education and raise a family when they are ready. So I had a statement at the beginning about people sacrificing their education, and then in the at the end of the essay, I went back to sacrificing education. So we've made a complete transition from the beginning to the end. If I mentioned a survey at the beginning, maybe I could go back to that same survey at the end. Of the 68% of sexually active students, almost all said they would be in favor of having protection available on campus if it was offered in a free, anonymous form. So of course, when I say protection, I'm talking about condoms or birth control or something like that. You don't necessarily have to agree with these things. I'm just giving you examples of what we could do at the beginning and what we could do at the end of an essay. If I had started out with a story in an essay, I could go back to that story in my conclusion. Remember Marco, who I mentioned earlier? He has a roommate named Carlos who received honest and open education about sex in his high school classes. He has a girlfriend too, and they're happily getting to know each other and planning to move in together after graduation. Maybe they'll have children, but at least Carlos has a choice. You can see how if I told a story at the beginning that was tragic and desperate, and then I told a story at the end that was hopeful, I could relate those two to each other, and the reader would feel like we're at a natural conclusion. Okay, so as you're working on your narrative, you can definitely try out one of these strategies to get started, or you can just start simply by going straight into the opening or the inciting incident. The point is, whatever you do at the beginning, try to find a way to include that at the end. See if you can come full circle. If some topic that you raised in the first few sentences, you can revisit in the last few sentences. Okay? The very last thing I want to talk about is this thing in the middle. In our case, our thesis is going at the end, because for the narrative, the thesis is the lesson that you learned. So if we're talking about how to end it, you should end it on the lesson. You can feel free to use first person and make it clear what the story meant to you. It's totally okay to use I, me, my in these kinds of projects, in narrative projects. But I also want you to think about a look to the future or a call to action. A call to action means you're asking your audience to take some sort of action now that they have finished going through your project. So if I was writing about animal shelters and too many animals running loose, I might say at the end, please let the city know how you feel. Our elected officials need our votes, and we have the power to make this city into something great. Demand that they listen, vote for candidates that support this initiative, share this idea with somebody else. Together we can make this happen. So you can see that there are definitely actions that I'm offering the reader. I'm saying that they could do any of a variety of things to show the support for the side that I have argued in my paper or the lesson that I've learned. I included here a lot of ways to call your reader to action. You could ask them to believe something, to convince others to believe something, to donate money, to donate time, to change their behavior, to not change their behavior, stay the same, stay the course, keep doing the right thing, to vote for something, to build something, to try something, to create something. Any of these would be an action that you want the reader to take. So as you're ending, remember that at the end of your narrative, you're trying to come up with a lesson or a thesis, and you're trying to come up with some kind of action. Okay, so hopefully these hooks help you get started. Remembering the hook at the end helps you close and have a strong last line. But as you're doing the rest of the end, you're remembering the thesis and the action. Okay, if you have any questions about this topic, please write them down so that we can talk about them in class. I'm sure that all of this is new to you, and maybe you haven't tried these things before. You're also going to read chapter 19 about introductions and conclusions. And again, not all of it applies to a narrative, but it's good to know these things for the next essay that we go into. Next week, we're starting our argument, and we will definitely follow these introduction and conclusion strategies there. Okay, so go ahead and take a look back at your narrative and see if you can make a full circle to engage your reader and then give them some closure at the end. Good luck, guys, and I'll see you in class.